How a Soviet spy in Tokyo saved Moscow. The telegram that changed the war. October 14, 1941. Richard Sorge stood at his apartment window in Tokyo's Azabu district. He looked at the night city below. The city didn't know about the information he'd just received. Information that would change World War II's course. He was 46 years old, a Soviet spy of German origin. He worked undercover as a journalist at the German embassy in Tokyo. For 8 years in Japan, he'd built history's most effective spy network. Tonight, at a reception in Japanese General Headquarters, he'd learned something crucial. The answer to a question that would determine the Soviet Union's fate. Japan wouldn't attack the USSR. The Japanese Imperial Army was preparing to strike American bases in the Pacific Ocean, most likely Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, within the next 2 months. Sorge got this information from his source in government, a man named Ozaki Hatsumi, advisor to Prime Minister Konoe, who was secretly a communist, a member of his network for 6 years. The information was absolutely reliable. Ozaki attended a secret Imperial Council meeting, where they made this decision, where Emperor Hirohito personally approved the plan. War against America instead of war against the Soviet Union. Sorge understood this report's historical significance better than anyone else. Right now, decisive battles raged near Moscow. German troops of Army Group Center stood 25 kilometers from the Kremlin, ready for the final assault on the Soviet capital. Stalin kept 25 Siberian divisions in the Far East, about 400,000 elite soldiers, waiting for possible Japanese invasion from the east. If Japan attacked the Soviet Union from the east, while Germans attacked from the west, the USSR would face a two-front war, and probably lose. But if Japan didn't attack, these Siberian divisions could move to Moscow, where they might turn the battle's tide for the capital. The secret transmission SOR approached his secret radio transmitter, hidden under floorboards in the house basement. He'd used it to contact Moscow for 8 years. His radio operator Max Clausen waited with ready equipment, a German communist who'd fled Germany in '33. Sorge dictated a short but fateful message in German language. Clausen encoded it and sent it to Moscow in Morse code. Japan has decided to start war against USA and Britain within 2 months. Attack on USSR is excluded. Source is reliable. You can safely transfer troops from Far East. Ramsey. Ramsey was his code name in correspondence with Center, named after a medieval Egyptian city, where he'd once studied archaeology before becoming a spy. 1933. Sorge remembered arriving in Tokyo 8 years ago, undercover as a German journalist, working for Frankfurter Zeitung newspaper. He was the perfect spy, born in Russia to a German father and Russian mother. Grew up in Germany, fought in World War I for the Kaiser. He was wounded, became a communist, fled to the Soviet Union. After Hitler came to power, GRU recruited him in '24. Soviet military intelligence. They sent him to work first in Germany, then China, then Japan. His cover legend was flawless. A real German journalist, Nazi party member, friend of ambassadors and generals, lover of sake and Japanese geisha, open, friendly, drinking a bit, completely unlike a Soviet spy. Over 8 years in Tokyo, Sorge built a network. 15 agents, embedded in Japanese government, Army, Navy, and German embassy. His main source was Ozaki Hatsumi, brilliant Japanese economist, secret communist, who rose to advisor to Prime Minister, had access to all Imperial Council secrets. Ozaki was an ideological communist. He believed he was helping world revolution's cause by passing imperialist Japan secrets to the Soviet Union. Sorge also got information from German military attaché Colonel Ott, his close friend, who didn't suspect his drinking buddy. Passed every word to Moscow. The double life. Sorge lived a dangerous double life. By day, he was a respectable German journalist. He attended embassy receptions, wrote articles for German newspapers, met with Japanese officials. By night, he encoded reports, met agents in secret places, transmitted instructions, received documents, photographed secret materials. Every day he risked exposure and execution. Japanese counterintelligence Kempeitai was brutal and effective. Espionage was punished by hanging. Torture of suspects was common practice. But Sorge was the highest class professional. He never made mistakes, never left traces, never exposed his agents without extreme necessity. For 8 years, he sent Moscow hundreds of reports about Japanese military plans, about German-Japanese relations, about Tokyo's strategic intentions. He reported the exact date of Germany's attack on USSR, June 22, 41, 3 weeks before war started. Though Stalin didn't believe this information, didn't take proper measures. He transmitted data about Japanese offensive plans in China, about Kwantung Army forces in Manchuria, about Japanese fleet plans. His information saved thousands of Soviet soldiers, helped avoid strategic errors, gave Stalin an advantage in knowing the enemy's plans. But the October 41 report was his most important message, because it directly affected Moscow's fate, and possibly the entire war. Moscow in November 1941. While Sorge sent his report from Tokyo, catastrophe unfolded in Moscow. German Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock started Operation Typhoon, the final offensive on the Soviet capital. More than 1 million German soldiers advanced, 1,000 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, moving in 3 directions toward Moscow, crushing Soviet defense. By late October, Germans captured Mozhaisk, reached Volokolamsk Highway, stood in direct sight of Kremlin towers. Panic gripped Moscow. Government agencies evacuated to Kuibyshev. The diplomatic corps was leaving. Mass flight of population from the city began. Stalin remained in the Kremlin, coordinating defense. But he understood something clearly. Without fresh reserves, Moscow couldn't hold. Soviet troops near Moscow were exhausted. They'd suffered enormous losses. They lacked tanks, artillery, ammunition. Germans had numerical superiority and initiative. Their morale was high. After 5 months of continuous victories, the general staff reported to Stalin something grim. Without reinforcements, Moscow's fall was a matter of weeks. The only major reserve was Siberian divisions. In the Far East, fresh, well-trained, armed troops, hardened by harsh climate, ready for winter war. But Stalin didn't dare remove them from the far eastern border, fearing a Japanese stab in the back. Stalin's decision, Sorge's report arrived in Moscow on October 15th. It was immediately delivered to Stalin. He read it several times, not believing it could be true, too good to be true, too convenient at a moment, when he desperately needed these troops. Maybe it was disinformation, planted by Germans through their Japanese allies, to make him remove troops from the Far East, before a Japanese strike. Stalin summoned GRU Chief General Golikov. He demanded an assessment of the information's reliability. Golikov reported that Ramsey was the most reliable source, working in Tokyo for 8 years, never giving false information. His reports were always confirmed by events. If Ramsey said Japan wouldn't attack the USSR, this could be believed. Stalin made a decision. That required enormous courage and faith in intelligence information. He ordered immediate transfer of Siberian divisions, from the Far East to Moscow. 25 divisions, 400,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. They began moving west, along the Trans-Siberian Railway. This was a colossal risk. If Sorja was wrong or deceived, if Japan still attacked, the Far East would remain defenseless. Vladivostok would fall. The Soviet Union would get a two-front war. But if Sorja was right, these troops would save Moscow, and possibly the entire Soviet Union. Stalin was betting on one man's information, in Tokyo, risking a whole country's fate. December 6, 1941. First trains with Siberian divisions began arriving in Moscow in late November. Soldiers in white camouflage suits, hardened by Transbaikal frosts, used to fighting in 30-degree cold. They unloaded from trains, immediately headed to the front. They brought not just numerical reinforcement, but also fresh fighting spirit, faith in victory, readiness to attack, not just defend. By early December, sufficient forces concentrated near Moscow for a counteroffensive that Germans didn't even suspect. German command believed the Red Army was defeated, incapable of large offensive operations. Intelligence reported Soviet reserve exhaustion, troop demoralization, imminent fall of Moscow. German soldiers were exhausted from 5 months of offensive, suffering from 30-degree frosts, without winter uniforms. They believed one more push, and Moscow would fall. The war would end. They'd go home. Some advanced German units reached Khimki metro station, from where they could see through binoculars, the Kremlin towers. But this was maximum German advance. They went no further. On December 6, 41, the Red Army began counteroffensive. Near Moscow, 3 fronts struck at stretched German positions. Siberian divisions formed the offensive's shock force, used to frosts, equipped for winter war, fresh and full of strength. They broke German defense at several points. Germans weren't expecting an offensive, not ready for winter war, suffering from frostbite and supply shortages. They began retreating. For the first time in the entire war, Wehrmacht rolled back, losing territory, abandoning equipment, suffering heavy losses. The turning point. The counteroffensive near Moscow became a turning point. Germans were thrown back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was destroyed. Strategic initiative began passing to the Red Army. Hitler was furious. He dismissed several generals, including Ground Forces Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. He took Army command himself. But the damage was done. Blitzkrieg had failed. The war became protracted. Germany was drawn into a war of attrition that it couldn't win. And all this became possible thanks to one Soviet spy's report in Tokyo, who told Stalin something crucial, that he could safely transfer Siberian divisions to the west. October 18, 1941, arrest. While events unfolded near Moscow, Richard Sorge in Tokyo knew his time was running out. Japanese counterintelligence Kempeitai had long suspected. A Soviet spy network existed in the capital. They were investigating, checking suspicious foreigners. After sending the October report, radio transmission activity increased. Direction finders detected the transmitter's location. Surveillance began on suspects. Ozaki Hatsumi was first to be arrested. On October 15th, they took him, right in his office. They searched his house, found compromising documents. Under torture, he broke. He named Sorge as the network's leader. On October 18th, 4 days after sending the fateful report, Kempeitai agents came for Sorge. They arrested him at the German embassy, where he'd come to meet Ambassador Ott. Ott was shocked, his best friend, the man he'd trusted with all secrets, was a Soviet spy. Sorge didn't resist arrest, didn't try to flee, didn't deny charges. He knew the game was over. That evidence against him was sufficient. For execution, that there was no escape. 3 years in prison. They placed him in Sugamo Prison, in Tokyo, where political criminals were held. Interrogations continued for months. The Japanese wanted to know everything about his network, his agents, the transmitted information. Sorge behaved with dignity. He answered questions selectively, admitted his guilt, but didn't betray agents who weren't yet arrested. They tortured him, but not cruelly. The Japanese treated him with certain respect, as the highest class professional, a worthy opponent. The trial of him and Ozaki lasted 2 years. Investigation gathered evidence, questioned witnesses, documented every crime. Sorge was held in solitary confinement. They allowed him books, paper for writing, even alcohol in limited quantities. He wrote extensive memoirs about his work, described in detail network creation, information transmission, working methods. These notes became a unique document on intelligence history that the Japanese confiscated after his death. The Soviet government didn't try to save Sorge. It officially denied any connection with him, called him a German journalist, having no relation to USSR. Stalin never publicly acknowledged Sorge worked for Soviet intelligence, didn't offer prisoner exchange, didn't make diplomatic efforts for his salvation. Sorge was abandoned, as spies are abandoned when they're exposed and no longer represent value. November 7, 1944. The military tribunal sentenced Sorge to death by hanging. The sentence was passed in September 43, but execution was delayed. Japanese government hoped to use him for exchange with Japanese prisoners in USSR, but Moscow refused the exchange. They stated they didn't know any Richard Sorge, that he was a German citizen, and USSR had no relation to him. For Sorge, this was the final betrayal. The country he'd given 20 years of life, risking every day, transmitting information that saved Moscow, disowned him in his final days. On November 7, 44, anniversary of the October Revolution, they hanged Richard Sorge and Ozaki Hatsumi at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. Sorge was 49 years old. He'd spent the last 3 years in a cell. Not knowing his October 41 report had helped save Moscow. He didn't know about the December 6th counteroffensive, about the German defeat near the capital, about how Siberian divisions, transferred thanks to his information, had turned the battle's tide. His last words were Soviet Union and Comintern. He died a communist, true to his ideals, without receiving recognition from the country he'd served. 20 years of silence. The Japanese buried him at Zoshigaya Foreign Cemetery in Tokyo, without honors, without monument, as an ordinary criminal. The German embassy refused to recognize him as a German citizen. USSR refused to recognize him as a Soviet agent. He died a man without a country, without a name, without recognition. His grave remained nameless for 20 years, until in '64 the Soviet Union finally recognized him as their hero. 1964, recognition. 20 years after Sorge's death, the USSR kept silent about his fate and his work. Officially, he never existed. His name was classified. His role in saving Moscow was unknown even to military historians. But in the 60s, after Stalin's death, during Khrushchev's thaw, declassification began of some wartime materials. GRU prepared a report about Sorge's work in Tokyo, about his October 41 report, about this information's role in Stalin's decision to transfer Siberian divisions. to Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev read this report. He was shocked. He understood that Sorge was one of history's greatest spies, that his information helped save the Soviet capital at war's critical moment. Khrushchev ordered declassification of information about Sorge to award him posthumously Hero of the Soviet Union, to install a monument, to name streets after him. On November 5, 1964, 2 days before the 20th anniversary of his execution, the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet awarded Richard Sorge, Hero of the Soviet Union, posthumously the legacy. The Soviet government asked Japan to transfer Sorge's remains to USSR for burial with honors. The Japanese agreed, but the Soviet side ultimately decided to leave his grave in Tokyo as a symbol of his work in Japan. They installed a monument on the grave, red granite with Soviet star, and inscription in Russian and Japanese. Richard Sorge, Hero of the Soviet Union, intelligence officer who saved Moscow. The grave became a pilgrimage site for Soviet tourists, diplomats, intelligence officers visiting Japan. In Moscow, they installed a bronze bust of Sorge in a square on a street named after him. Museums opened exhibitions about his work. They made documentary films about his life and feat. Sorge became a Soviet intelligence legend, a symbol of professionalism, courage, devotion to duty. His story taught new generations of intelligence officers that one person in the right place at the right time can change history's course. What it means. Richard Sorge's story teaches several important lessons about war's nature and intelligence's role in strategic decisions. His October 41 report gave Stalin critical information at a critical moment. Knowledge that Japan wouldn't attack from the east allowed transfer of 400,000 soldiers to the Western Front, where they helped save Moscow. Without this information, Stalin wouldn't have dared to remove troops from the Far East. Without these troops, the December 6th counteroffensive would have been impossible. Without the counteroffensive, Moscow might have fallen. Moscow's fall in 1941 would have had catastrophic consequences for USSR and for the entire war's course. Loss of the capital would have been a terrible moral blow for the Soviet people, could have led to state governance collapse, to communication breakdown between fronts. Germans would have gotten enormous psychological victory, could have developed success further east, but Moscow's defense and December 1941 counteroffensive became Wehrmacht's first major defeat, destroyed the myth of German army invincibility, showed the world that Hitler could be stopped. This raised Soviet people's morale, strengthened faith in victory, proved that the Red Army could not only defend but also attack. And all this became possible thanks to information that one man in Tokyo, risking his life, transmitted to Moscow. The price Sorge paid maximum price for his report. He lost freedom, spent 3 years in prison, was executed at age 49. He didn't see USSR victory in the war, didn't learn his information, helped save Moscow, didn't receive recognition. During his lifetime, the country he'd served for 20 years disowned him. In his final days, refused to save him, left him to die in Japanese prison. Recognition came 20 years after his death, when he could no longer learn about his people's gratitude. Today, historians debate Sorge's information's exact role in saving Moscow. Some argue Stalin got confirmation of Japanese intentions from other sources, that the decision to transfer Siberian divisions was made based on combined data, not just on Sorge's report. Others point out that Sorge gave the most accurate and timely information, that his report was the decisive factor In Stalin's decision, the truth probably lies in the middle. Sorge gave critically important information at a critical moment that confirmed data from other sources and helped Stalin make one of war's most risky and important decisions. The final truth. In any case, Richard Sorge's story remains one of World War II's most dramatic and significant stories. This is a story about a man who, risking everything for a country he'd never see victorious, transmitted information that helped change history's greatest conflict's course. This is a story about intelligence information's price, about the courage of people, working in shadows, without recognition, without glory, knowing that, in case of failure, not just death awaits them, but also disavowal by their own country. Richard Sorge died alone in a Tokyo prison cell, disowned by the country he'd given everything to serve. But his October 14th telegram changed the war, saved Moscow, and helped defeat Nazi Germany. One man, one message. 400,000 soldiers transferred, Moscow saved. History changed.